Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nina Nesseth, and I am a staff scientist at Science North. Welcome to our professional learning coding series. Today, we will be running through a sample lesson looking at transformations for grades 3 and 4. I'm so happy that you could all join us today for this workshop. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Atitmiksheng, Anishinaabeg, and Wanapitei First Nation. We would also like to acknowledge the Métis Nation for their cultural and economic contribution in this area. These lands sit in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area, and as we are all treaty people, it is important for us to all be thinking about what treaty area we live in and are an active part of. Let's take a moment to appreciate the land that we are on by acknowledging the traditional territory and treaty that you are located in. As well, before we begin, I just wanted to introduce behind the scenes, we have my colleague, Mary, who will be, there she is, hi, Mary.
Hi, everybody.
And Mary will be overseeing the live chat today. So if at any point during today's session you have questions, please feel free to place your questions into the chat and Mary will respond to them as we go through our session today. As well, Mary will be throughout the session dropping links that, that will be useful for you during the lessons today and tomorrow. And just a few housekeeping things before we begin as well. I just wanted to point everyone towards a few resources that we have from Science North to support you as educators working in your classrooms, different ways that you can engage your students with content from Science North. So of course, you can visit our website at schools.sciencenorth.ca/justteachers here. And you can have access here to a list of all of our offerings from teacher workshops, such as this professional development opportunity that we're doing today, and educator resources. One great one that we have, for example, is our Science at Home series. And it's kind of small on the screen here, but it is in this green sidebar. And it has a whole series of lesson plans for K-8 that are STEM lesson plans that you can engage your students with, especially if you're doing online learning, synchronous learning with your students. So they're specially set up to be great hands-on experiences for your students while they're doing classroom activities from home that use materials that they can find easily around the house. And as well, all of our resources for our coding session, including ones that we've delivered already, live forever on the education.sciencenorth.ca website. You can see this middle banner here is labeled Professional Learning Coding Series. And if you click on this banner, it will bring you to the list by grade for each of the sessions that we've delivered so far, as well as our resources like the lesson plans, handouts, and coding guides, and the videos of our live sessions. So if, for example, for one of our sessions that you've signed up for, if you have to join late or if something comes up and you have to miss it, or if you just want to rewatch it, you can head over to this website and pull up the live video session recording and go back over the content that we cover today. And the session that we're covering today looks at transformations for grades 3 and 4. It is a two-part workshop. So today's workshop, we are going to be focusing specifically on the unplugged components of our lesson plans. So these are activities that will engage your students without a computer screen and sort of set up the foundations for the coding concepts that we are going to use when we open up our coding application tomorrow. And the program today does hit, of course, our coding curriculum under our C3 algebra expectations, and as well has very great connections to our geometric and spatial reasoning expectations, because we will be performing transformations on geometric shapes, including translations, reflections, and rotations on a grid. And so that is the same as well for our grade 4s. Now the connection for coordinates, transformations, and coding is actually super, super strong. A lot of your students will have already interacted and seen these transformations and coordinate systems in action if they've played any 2-dimensional, for example, or 3-dimensional games, because pretty much any games you need to use coordinate systems to place graphics onto a screen, and any object on that screen that we have to manipulate, for example, by pushing arrow keys, directional keys on a controller, tends to perform a transformation on whatever sprite or object they're controlling on that screen. For example, if anyone's ever played Tetris before, a classic example, we are performing translations to move our blocks around and fit them together, and rotations to try and get them into those sneaky spots to try and complete our lines. And how our program knows where the different sprite blocks are on our screen is by using coordinate systems. This is true for tabletop games as well. We use coordinate systems for a lot of games, such as, well, classically we would think of like Battleship or chess. This is a great opportunity if you have your students either in classroom or if they have access to different tabletop games at home, to be able to look at games that we know have coordinate systems, or to bring in other ones that are less obvious, like say tic-tac-toe or Connect 4, and see how we can actually interpret the steps of playing this game or communicate the steps of playing these games using coordinates. So I am going to describe an unplugged activity today that ideally would be performed in the classroom. Now, I am aware that right now it's a little bit challenging to be able to deliver our lessons and activities the way we would like to. But we do at Science North want this lesson to live on beyond the age of COVID-19 and the pandemic. So I will go through the lesson first in its sort of ideal circumstances, which would include all of us teaching within our classrooms face-to-face with our students. And then I will go through some possible iterations for this activity for if we have to teach with our students physically distanced within a classroom, or if we are teaching through synchronous learning online. So we can see on my slide that we have an image representing our classroom here. And not all classrooms, of course, are set up on a convenient grid system like this. So if you do have a classroom that is set up where it's very easy to turn your desk arrangement into a grid, that's great. Otherwise, you can easily set up a similar grid system if you have access to an open space, either within the classroom, outside, or in a gym, where you can have your students either sit or stand in an arrangement that we can form as a grid. So once we have our students in that sort of arrangement, we can then walk through our 2 axes for a grid, explain that we are using a grid so that we can more easily identify points on a grid and communicate locations and movement. And so we have our rows, so moving horizontally from left to right, we describe that as our x-axis. And we'll start at 0. And it is moving across a row, but the numbers are aligned with columns. So we have 0, 1, and 2. And then moving up the side of a column here, we can see our labels for the rows that go across. And this is our y-axis. So this is 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now, if we are trying to communicate points on a grid, then we would find where those 2 points intersect and communicate it, you can see on my chalkboard, in the form x, y. So for example, this bottom corner here, we have our x is 0 and our y is 0. So this desk in the bottom corner becomes then 0, 0 is its coordinate. So if I told a student to find 0, 0, 0, 0 would be our x, y, x is 0, y is 0, this corner right here. So our first challenge would be in looking at this coordinate system and having these rows and columns labeled appropriately with their numbers. And if you're doing this in a gem space or an open space, pylons would probably help a lot with this to kind of keep everything aligned. Challenge students to figure out where they are on this grid. So then each student will kind of like recognize where they are within this grid system, going from 0, 0, for example, to the other end of that same column would be 0, 3, because they're in the x is 0 line and they're in the y is 3 line. And you can even have students sort of practice kind of figuring out if they can guess what other students' numbers are, and kind of work together to make sure that everyone understands how to figure out their XY position by looking at the number of their row and the number of their column. Once students feel comfortable figuring out their coordinate and their position, then we are going to build shapes, just flat geometric shapes with string. So you'll probably need a very long string to do this. I'd say at least 50-foot string, if not 100-foot. It doesn't have to be a string per se. It can be jump ropes. It can be anything that would allow for shapes to be made. And say to students that we are going to, for example, make a square. Before you and your students make any of your shapes using the classroom grid system, you have to decide a few things. You need to know the length of your square or your shape, the length of the sides of your shape, how many corners it has, and the angle of that turn. We don't have to get into like the numerical values for this activity per se, but we have to be aware of those, especially for when we do the coding tomorrow. Now, say we want to create a square that is 2 desks per side. We know that we have a 90-degree angle at each corner, a right angle turn. And we want to move that square, we want to translate it up 2 desks and to the right by 1 desk to then redraw that square in a different part of the classroom. How would we do that? So the challenge here for our students is to break down this translation into its core steps. The easiest way to do that is to recognize that each corner of our square is a point with a coordinate that needs to be translated. And once our translation is performed, we know that our square afterwards has to be the same size, and it can't be pointing in any different directions because we don't have any rotations happening. So to make the description or the communication of our steps breakdown easier, we can assign each of these corners a letter. I've assigned them A, B, C, D. And if we wanted to move point A, so point A, oh, I mixed up which points. So this is actually describing 0, 1. Oh, no, that's my point A, 0 and 1. So point A is at desk 0, 1, and we know we need to move it up 2 desks and over 1 desk. So let's do the translation for that point. So we move up 1 desk, move up 2 desks, and move it to the right by 1 desk. And then we place our new point A at the point x equals 1 and y equals 3. And we will repeat that again for point B. So point B is at x equals 1, y equals 1. So how will we move this point over? In fact, it's going to be the exact same translation that we did for point A. We're going to move it, wrong way, up 2 desks and to the right by 1 desk. And then we will place it in its new location, its translated location, which is in x equals 2 and y equals 3. So now that we've done 2 examples together, how do we need to move point C? And so students will hopefully have seen the pattern that point C, once it moves up 2 desks and over 1, will be on desk 2, 2. And point D, which started in our corner here, origin at 0, 0, will move up 2 desks and over to the right by 1 desk to then be translated over to point 1, 2. And if we redraw our square, we now have a successful translation. And you can repeat the same translation activity with just the square moving around to different parts of the classroom. You can even choose a student to be part of the rules that we're breaking down for our algorithm, for example. So the steps that we're describing to move our square from one part of the classroom to the next is described using an algorithm or a set of instructions, just like how we would describe the steps in code. So for example, if I had my square with one corner at 0, 0, say that is Josh's desk. And say we want the point that's at Josh's desk to then be at Emily's desk over here. So what set of instructions will we have to make to move from a point from Josh's desk at 0, 0 to Emily's desk at 2, 1? So we can make it a bit more personal in that way. And then if we wanted to think more algorithmically and actually write down our instructions so we can see and break down the steps that we have, we can either write it in text. So to translate our square with these points, we want to move it up by 2 desks and move each point to the right by 1. Or we can describe it with arrows. The goal here is to understand and break down the sequence of events in order. And whichever way is the easiest to communicate for your students is ideal for understanding and moving on to the coding tomorrow. And here I have, of course, our new coordinates post-translation. And let's just repeat the activity one more time, but this time we'll do a rotation. Because of the limitations of my drawing, the rotation will be done around point 1, 1, which is at this exact center desk of my shape. I realize that usually when we're doing rotations, we're doing rotations around a point that is outside of the shape, for example, doing a rotation around 0, 0. But just for the sake of the example today, we'll do a rotation sort of on top of itself around that 1, 1 point right here. So when we do that, we're going to have our square. It's a bit bigger this time, and we're going to rotate a quarter turn around 1, 1. We're going to be doing that quarter turn clockwise. And just up here in the corner too, I did a little vertically oriented graphic to kind of show the changes that we're expecting to see with our rotation. So just like before, we are going to assign each corner of our square a point, A, B, C, and D. And we are going to describe the steps that we need to take to move each point a quarter turn. So in this case, when we ask our students what we would have to do, the steps are to move 2 desks to the right and 1 desk down. And it looks a lot like if you were looking at a clock face or a pie, a whole circle. It does look like the quarter of a pie. So it is very clearly a quarter turn once we sort of draw it out. So that was my point A, got moved 2 desks over and 1 desk down. and it gets placed right here at 0.21. And then if we repeat the same with point B, we continue around our clock. If we want to use that analogy, we're moving down 2 desks and 1 over. Isn't that an 8th rotation? Great question. Yeah, it is an 8th rotation. You're right. So we're moving. So we'll move our rotation around this way in an 8th rotation. Thank you for noticing that error there. So we will have our shape and have everything placed around. But we will notice the goal here was to see a pattern. So the pattern then ends up being 2 in one direction and then making our turn and proceeding forward by 1. And we're continuing that clockwise direction. So if I just go back again, so we'll have 1, 2, down, place, and then 1, 2, and then turning to the left, and then place, and then 1, 2, up, place, and then 1, 2, to the right, and place. So we can very clearly see a pattern that formed our rotation. And so we can see for our 8th turn again, and I'll make sure to catch that for next time I do my presentation. And we can very clearly see our pattern of moving up 2 points into the right 1, 2 to the right and down 1, and continuing with that pattern to place our new coordinates. So the goal here for this activity again is to look at the steps that we have to perform these transformations and to be able to describe them and break them down. And this will be very, very helpful for our session tomorrow. Now, our lesson for today includes within its resources a couple of handout activities just to further strengthen using coordinate systems as well as describing transformations. One of such activities is this one here, where students are given a list of coordinates and asked to shade in the corresponding boxes on a grid to create an image. So in this case, for most of our examples, we've used coordinate systems where the numbers are assigned to the lines on a grid. In this case, the numbers are assigned to the spaces on a grid. So it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different of an application for using coordinate systems. But for example, if students shade in the appropriate coordinates, they will get an image, a recognizable image. And then the second question for this particular activity invites students to create their own coordinate design using a grid. And in terms of assessment, it's a matter of checking to make sure that the squares that they have shaded in on their grid correspond with the coordinates that they have identified in describing the steps to drawing their personal designs. And for the transformations handout, it is simple exercise of moving 1 point on a shape to a predetermined location on a grid, and to be able to describe the steps needed to move from our start point to our transformed location. And whether they describe those steps in terms of written statements or in terms of directing with arrows is up to you and the level at which you feel your students are for completing this activity. And the answer key, of course, is included for this activity as well. Now, I do want to go back to the first desks activity for a second now, because I realized we didn't discuss potential adaptations for teaching either with physical distancing or remotely. So in terms of being able to teach this with physical distancing in the classroom, we have the opportunity to easily do this activity by simply spreading students out. If, for example, you have access, as I mentioned, to a gym or to an outdoor area, you can just spread out your grid system with your students either seated or standing to do this activity pretty easily, where their only contact would be that they would be touching the same string. So in terms of as long as everyone's distanced and wearing the appropriate gear, the risk of transmission with people handling a string is very low. And in terms of synchronous learning, unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to have physical interaction with each other to create and move shapes. So we would have to go with a more classic example of bringing a slide with a grid on screen and describing, working together as a class to describe transformations and manipulate shapes on a grid on screen. That can be done fairly easily with a whiteboard app or with PowerPoint, if you're very savvy with PowerPoint and drawing in those ways. But unfortunately for teaching this particular unplugged activity online, you have to rely a bit more on sort of the traditional tools of using an image of a grid and moving things around. You could even do something like this slide here where we can, where we can translate the points one by one with our students. And this was made in PowerPoint. And I'm just going to skip back ahead. Absolutely. So Linda suggested that you could use a grid view on the screen with students' names. You can, as long as students, if the software that you use places students in, yes, thank you, Mary, as long as the students are placed in the same. I know for some applications such as Zoom, the placement of students on that grid would not be the same for everyone. So I may have, Susie to my right, but on Susie's screen, I'm below her. So that wouldn't work in that case. But a screenshot may work, absolutely. Or, for example, you could preset a graphic with everyone's name on it. So they still have that personal element of having a space associated with them personally. So you could create a grid manually, or you could take a screenshot as you suggest. The screenshot's a nice idea because then you know that you're representing those who are present in your virtual session. It's always challenging when you build a grid, including people who may not be present for the activity. This was a bit of a shorter unplug lesson today. For tomorrow, we will be using the coordinate systems that we discussed and of course transformations. We will be using the pen tool in the free application Scratch to draw geometric shapes and apply transformations to them. Mary just added the Scratch link into the live chat, which I encourage you to check out today if you're not familiar with it, to sort of spend some time exploring the site. It is a free application and an account is not required to do the activity that we are going to do tomorrow. If you do have an account or if you have a classroom account, that's great, but it's not necessary. And as well, it is not necessary to have accounts for each of your students if you are choosing to deliver lessons through Scratch with your students, although they may want their own accounts if they want to save projects and revisit them, especially if they want to revisit them outside of school as well. So that brings us to the end of today's lesson. On screen, I do have a few housekeeping bits. So Mary is going to be adding a link to our survey, which if you have any feedback about today's session, please let us know your thoughts. We are always looking for ways to improve our offerings so that we are meeting your needs for your classroom. And as well, I have our educators@sciencenorth.ca email address here on screen. And you can access this email to connect with any of the Bluecoats who are currently working on the development of these lesson plans for you. So if you run into any questions that you have or any roadblocks, either during the sessions, if there's something that you didn't quite catch, or if there are additional questions that you'd like, or if you'd just like to ask us for help with learning how to code, you can send us an email at educators@sciencenorth.ca, and we will be happy to either set up a meeting with you to do a sort of one-on-one session to answer your questions, or if it's an easy question to answer, just correspond with you over email. I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow for part 2, where we will be coding in Scratch. I hope everyone has a great evening, and thank you so much.